Hi folks, today we're going to be studying Mrs. Midas by Caroline Duffy. Before I get started, this is a longer poem, so feel free to split this into two so you can study it on the first and second days that you would get English this week. You will be allowed more time to study this poem because it is a little bit longer and it is quite challenging as well. So before I get started, maybe get yourself sorted with a snack or a cup of tea and make sure you're comfortable. And make sure that you've got the poem in front of you as well, be that in a Google document or a printed copy of the poem, for instance, in your poems booklet. You're also going to need something to write with because there's a lot of background information to this poem and some vocabulary that will be unfamiliar to you. So first of all, who was King Midas? So this is the person the poem is based on, and it was a Greek myth. In Greek mythology, King Midas was granted a wish by the god Dionysus. Midas asked to have the ability to turn everything into gold, but this backfired on him because soon he started to turn his loved ones into gold statues. He also couldn't eat anything because his food would turn to gold, so he begged for his powers to be reversed. This is a bit of a warning about the corrupting influence of greed and the negative impact that greed can have on a person. Caroline Duffy reimagines the story of King Midas as though it was happening in 20th century England. The poem's speaker is King Midas's wife, and this comes from a collection of poems where Duffy kind of reimagines famous stories and famous myths, famous fairy tales as well, and retells them from the point of view of a woman in the story, or reimagines a female character to tell that particular story. It's a great recollection, and some of the poems are quite funny as well. I would definitely recommend it. So the poem explores how Mrs. Midas feels about the situation with her husband and what type of a person her husband is to have asked for this type of wish. So something for you to write down now. It's written in the form of a dramatic monologue. You might be familiar with this term from drama. And when we talk about a dramatic monologue in terms of poetry, it's a poem in the form of a speech or a narrative by a speaker where they inadvertently reveal aspects of their character, so what type of a person they are, by describing a situation or a series of events. The poem is made up of 11 six-line stanzas of equal length, but it does not rhyme. It is quite a kind of structured and rigid format, and this contrasts with the chaotic content of the poem. So the poem is about quite a chaotic and stressful situation. On to vocabulary now. Some of this is vocabulary and some of it is more kind of references that you'll need to know. We're going to start off with blanching. So I'd like you to take a note of these different vocabulary words either in your jotter or on a document. Blanching is a method of cooking where you boil something and then submerge it in water. Fondant d'automne is a type of pear. The field of the cloth of gold is actually a historical reference more so than a bit of vocabulary for you. It was something that happened in the 1500s, where it was essentially a meeting between King Henry VIII, who you'll know is the one that had all the different wives, and King Francis I. Now, it wasn't actually a field with cloth of gold. It was referred to the field of the cloth of gold because it was a very extravagant event where both kings were trying to show off their wealth to one another. It was essentially like a big festival, okay? Miss Macready is the housekeeper in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which you might have seen the film or read the book, who's more interested in showing off the house to visitors than supervising the children in her care. You'll see that this is important because Miss Macready's actions in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe could be said to kind of mirror what King Midas does, because he too is more preoccupied with appearances and showing off what he has rather than the people he cares about. And then we've got some references to gold here. Now, references to gold and the colour gold are quite common in this poem, so look out for them. First of all, we've got burnished, which means a polished metal. Aurum, which is a Latin word for gold. Luteous, which is a lovely word, meaning a kind of greenish yellow, so an almost kind of gold colour. Tutankhamun, an Egyptian pharaoh. Halcyon, which means calm and peaceful. Ore, which is a type of rock that contains precious metal. And Pan, who is the Greek god of nature and of things like shepherds as well. So we've got another kind of Greek mythology reference here. Alright, so we're now going to move on to the analysis. Make sure you've got your poem in front of you. And if you use highlighters to use a kind of key, I'd recommend these different categories for you to look out for. I'll let you pause the video now if you're going to be making a key for yourself, but just before you do so, I'd like to just point out imagery. Some of you are getting confused with imagery at the moment, which is fine because we've not looked at it for a little while now. Imagery is not word choice, okay? Imagery is simile, metaphor, and personification. So I'd like you to please bear that in mind, because when we're doing our 8 markers on imagery, some of you are talking about word choice, all right? So please talk about simile, metaphor, and personification when referencing imagery. Okay, so stanza 1. In this stanza, we are first introduced to Mrs. Midas, and it's a very domestic scene. So she's pouring herself a glass of wine and trying to relax. So I'm going to read the stanza out to you first of all, and then we're going to analyse it line by line. It was late September. I'd just poured a glass of wine, begun to unwind while the vegetables cooked. The kitchen filled with the smell of itself, relaxed its steamy breath, gently blanching the windows. So I opened one, then with my fingers wiped the other's glass like a brow. He was standing under the pear tree, snapping a twig. So first of all, this very first line, we've got it was late September. So we associate September with things coming to an end, specifically this summer coming to an end. And this could be said to mirror what is going to happen to their relationship. We also associate September with all the beautiful colours that we see in autumn and the sort of golden leaves that you see falling from the trees. So straight away we've got a kind of implicit, so not direct, reference to gold. Then we've got some lovely word choice here, creating a calm and laid back atmosphere, glass of wine, unwind, relaxed. And then there's a bit of personification, which describes the kitchen and creates a kind of warm and relaxing, homely atmosphere. So you'll know that a kitchen cannot have breath. It's referring to the condensation on the windows and when your windows seep up when you're cooking something. There's personal pronouns here, suggesting that the poem is told in first person from the point of view of Mrs. Midas. By using the word he, we're introduced to her husband, King Midas, in the final line of stanza 1. And then we've got a simile here. So just as someone might wipe their brow, so too does Mrs. Midas wipe the condensation from the windows. I think as well, by using the simile wipe their brow or like a brow, it's suggesting that Mrs. Midas really cares for her home. In this final line, when we're introduced to Mr. Midas or King Midas for the first time, there's a sense of contrast because we've got Mrs. Midas who is in a very relaxed, homely atmosphere, and then we've got Mr. Midas who is distant from her physically, he's outside, and he's also doing something that is quite destructive. He's snapping a twig. Snapping is a bit of word choice here that connotes something violent and chaotic. This hints towards the chaos that is going to unfold throughout this poem. Okay, so stanza 2, we've got Mrs. Midas, she's still in her kitchen, and Mr. Midas is still outside, and she sees him taking a pear from their lovely pear tree that they have in their garden. Now the garden was long and the visibility poor. The way the dark of the ground seems to drink the light of the sky, but that twig in his hand was gold. And then he plucked a pear from a branch. We grew fondant d'automne, and it sat in his palm like a light bulb on. I thought to myself, is he putting fairy lights in the tree? Okay, so we've got a contrast here again. Mrs. Midas is inside and King Midas is outside. suggestive of a physical and emotional distance between the couple. And then visibility poor is a bit of word choice here, which connotes that she's unable to see clearly. So Mrs. Midas is struggling to comprehend what she's witnessing. So not only can she not see because it is so dark, but it's like she can't believe her eyes. It's also suggestive of the fact that she doesn't really fully understand what is going to come next. She can't see what is coming. And then this bit of personification here, the dark of the ground seems to drink the light of the sky. It's telling us how dark it is outside, but it's also a bit ominous and a bit, threatening, because it reflects the idea of life being drained from something in a similar way to when Midas touches something and drains the life from it. Okay? It's not like the lovely personification that we've seen in previous Duffy poems, like the laugh of a bell. It's very threatening and creating a bit of tension here. And then we've got our first reference to gold, which is going to come up quite a bit. So fondant d'automne is a type of pear, but the name actually translates to the melting of autumn. Now these pears are meant to be incredibly sweet, and melting is also a word that we would associate with gold. I think as well the fact that Mrs. Midas is talking about how our garden is very long and how she grows fondant d'automne, it's suggesting that she's kind of showing off about our big lovely, garden and our big nice house. Mrs. Midas and King Midas are both portrayed to be quite aspirational people throughout this poem who want to be seen as wealthy and want to be seen as having a very beautiful home and beautiful things. And they're almost quite snobbish, okay? So you're going to see that throughout the poem. And it sat in his palm like a light bulb. So we've got a nice simile here. Like a light bulb is a simile, just as a light bulb is round and bright, so too is the pear illuminated from being turned to gold. Please make sure you're using the just as so to structure, which I've modelled here for you. You could also say that a light bulb moment is a moment of discovery, and both Midas and Mrs. Midas are discovering his new power. Then the short sentence on adds to the simile by comparing the pear to a light bulb that is switched on, emphasising the bright colour of the object. Then this last little line here, we've got a bit of humour. I thought to myself, is he putting fairy lights in the tree? This rhetorical question emphasises that she's quite confused about the situation and quite shocked at seeing her husband's power. Okay, stanza 3 is about Midas coming through the house and he's starting to turn everything into gold. It makes Mrs. Midas think of a school history lesson with Miss McCready about the field of the cloth of gold, which you now know about from the start of the lesson, the meeting between Henry VIII and the King of France in 1520. We've got the third person pronoun here, he, used rather than his name. This reflects the blame placed on Midas by his wife, and it suggests a lack of intimacy. She's not calling him by his first name, she's using the word he, which suggests a bit of distance between them two. He came into the house, the doorknobs gleamed, he drew the blinds, the mind I thought of the field of the cloth of gold, and of Miss Macready. He sat in that chair like a king on a burnished throne. The look on his face was strange, wild, vain. I said, what in the name of God is going on? He started to laugh. Okay, so again, bit of humour in this stanza, but also more anxiety and more worry. We've got the field of the cloth of gold, which was the site of a meeting between King Henry VIII and King Francis I, and they were trying to outshine each other. So like we said earlier in the lesson, it was a big kind of grand meeting, and they were trying to show how wealthy they were. And then Miss Macready, so we can assume that it was, the speaker's teacher, so Mrs. Midas's teacher, who taught her about the field of the cloth of gold. but it could be an allusion to the housekeeper in Narnia, who, as we've discussed, was more interested in showing off the house than supervising the children in her care. Just like Midas, who is more interested in turning things into gold than caring for the people that he loves. He sat in that chair like a king on a burnished throne, another lovely simile here, showing off his wealth and status. The look on his face was strange, wild, vain, so this has connotations of being out of control, selfish and greedy. Then this lovely little rhetorical question here is adding another kind of sense of humour to this stanza, and it's quite a humorous tone in this stanza here at the end. She's saying, what in the name of God is going on? And this is reaffirming the fact that she's in complete disbelief. She can't believe what she's seeing, and she's getting quite, irate with him. She's getting quite annoyed. But he started to laugh, so Midas isn't actually taking this situation seriously. And there's more contrast between the two characters here. She's getting quite worried and quite annoyed, and he is finding the situation quite amusing. Okay, stanza 4. Mrs. Midas attempts to instill a sense of normality, and she uses a matter of fact tone in serving up dinner, but she knows something's not right. So there's more of a humorous tone in these first few lines here. I served up the meal. For starters, corn on the cob. Within seconds he was spitting out the teeth of the rich. He toyed with his spoon, then mine, then with the knives, the forks. He asked, where was the wine? I poured with a shaking hand, a fragrant, bone-dry white from Italy, then watched as he picked up the glass, goblet, golden chalice, drank. So there's comic effect here because Mrs. Midas is continuing to go about her domestic chores despite the absurd situation. This metaphor here saying he was spitting out the teeth of the rich, well, the kernels of corn in the cob kind of looks almost like the shape of teeth. So this metaphor here is quite humorous, and it's, showing us how he is turning everything into gold. So just as very wealthy people in olden times would have had golden teeth, so too do the kernels look like little pieces of gold or little golden teeth. He toyed with his spoon, then mine, then with the knives, the forks. We've got a list here to emphasise amount and variety, which you will know from RUEE. So a list, remember, always emphasises amount or variety. And it's here emphasising all the different household objects that he's turning into gold. The word choice of shaking brings in this sense of fear and anxiety. So she's trying to keep things normal, but you can see that she's quite scared of what her husband is now able to do. And then a fragrant, bone-dry white from Italy is, again suggestive of Mrs. Midas's very aspirational personality. Okay, so she's showing off about her fancy wine, even though she's in this very bizarre situation that's quite dangerous. And then glass, goblet, golden, chalice, drank. This is a bit of alliteration here of the harsh consonant G, glass, goblet, golden. I'd like to just remind you as well that alliteration is not imagery, so please don't get confused with that. But it is definitely a bit of onomatopoeia here because it sounds almost like somebody taking a drink. It sounds almost like the glug of taking a drink. Glass, goblet, golden. All right, on to stanza 5, where reality is starting to sink in, and Mrs. Midas is genuinely quite scared of her husband, and there's a bit more tension starting to creep into this stanza. It was then that I started to scream. He sank to his knees. After we both calmed down, I finished the wine on my own, hearing him out. I made him sit on the other side of the room and keep his hands to himself. I locked the cat in the cellar. I moved the phone. The toilet I didn't mind. I couldn't believe my ears. Okay, so straight away started to scream. Scream connotes fear and despair, and this is a very dramatic opening as she is genuinely terrified, but he's starting to realise how serious the situation is as he sinks to his knees. There is a little bit of humour here in the fact that despite everything going on, she has still finished the wine. And there's a bit of humour in her telling him to get on the other side of the room and keep his hands to himself. However, despite the humour, there's also, the kind of sadness of it because there's a lack of intimacy between them, and there's also physical and emotional distance brought on by these circumstances. Then we've got a series of short sentences here to emphasise the different ways that his power will impose upon their lives. So she's trying to hide all the things in their house to make sure that he can't turn them into gold. But again, we see her aspirations of having this really beautiful, extravagant house because she's like, well, it doesn't matter if he turns the toilet gold. That would be quite a nice, expensive thing to have. So she's fine with that. Then we end here with I couldn't believe my ears, and there's a bit of enjambment following on to stanza 6, okay, because the line is going to carry on. In stanza 6, Mrs. Midas starts to realise what an idiot her husband has been, but she's trying to make light of the situation as well. Like I said, there's a bit of enjambment, so when the line runs over, how he'd had a wish. Look, we all have wishes granted, but who has wishes granted him? Do you know about gold? It feeds no one. Autumn, soft, untarnishable, slakes no thirst. He tried to light a cigarette. I gazed entranced as the blue flame played on its luteous stem. At least I said, you'll be able to give up smoking for good. So we've got a bit more humour here. She's saying, well, at least he's going to be able to give up the smoking because everything he touches turns to gold. There's a bit of wordplay as well because granted means, admittedly. So she's saying, okay, admittedly, we all have wishes granted, but who has their wishes actually granted? So it's something that is true, but also to have a wish accepted. Then the word choice of him, again, this very short sentence for impact, it emphasises her disgust. She's not referring to him by name, so she's distanced herself from him, but you can also just imagine, her saying this in an angry tone of voice, him. So yeah, it's adding to this idea that she's really pretty annoyed with Mr. Midas now. Another wee rhetorical question here, do you know about gold? And then the list is emphasising the negative attributes of gold and revealing the lack of true value that gold has. Autumn, soft, untarnishable, slakes no thirst. So it has no actual purpose or value. Okay, we're now going to move on to stanza 7, where we explore the damage that King Midas's wish has had on their relationship. This is quite a sad stanza now. So we've had quite a bit of humour, but it's now going to be a bit of a kind of poignant stanza, talking about what they've lost. Separate beds. In fact, I put a chair against my door, near petrified. He was below, turning the spare room into the tomb of Tutankhamun. You see, we were passionate then, in those halcyon days, unwrapping each other rapidly like presents. Fast food. But now I feared his honeyed embrace, the kiss that would turn my lips to a work of art. Okay, so little minor sentence here at the start, separate beds, connoting a lack of intimacy between the two and suggesting a strain on their relationship. Okay, so the short sentence as well is highlighting the negative impact that his wish had on their marriage. Remember, a minor sentence, by the way, folks, is a sentence without a verb or a main verb in it. You'll remember this from War Photographer. Remember, Belfast, Beirut, pen on pen. Okay? And then, in fact, I put a chair against my door near petrified. Petrified here, the word choice tells us how terrified Mrs. Midas is, but petrified can also mean to be, frozen. So it's suggestive of what would happen should her husband manage to turn her to gold. He was below, turning the spare room into the tomb of Tutankhamun. So this is a metaphor comparing Midas to an Egyptian pharaoh who would have, presumably been buried in a very extravagant way, presumably with, plenty of gold, and it's suggestive of his wealth and status. But we've also got a bit of humour here through the rhyme of spare room and Tutankhamun. Okay, then the use of you establishes a conversational tone, so quite a laid back tone, and it's addressing the reader directly. It's almost like Mrs. Midas is telling us a story here, like it's, our friend telling us something that's happened to them. We introduces a sense of nostalgia, which, if you'll remember, means looking back on something fondly. So she's remembering a time when they were truly a happy couple. Passionate connotes desire, and halcyon suggests calmness and peace. Then we have a simile here, unwrapping each other rapidly like presents, fast food. But now I feared his honeyed embrace, a kiss that would turn my lips to a work of art. This simile compares their intimacy to a gift, which is something that they long for. Okay, so it's comparing when they did love each other to something special, something that's exciting. Okay, so unwrapping each other almost is, reminiscent of Christmas presents, unwrapping something that you really want. Fast food has connotations of indulgence, but I suppose you could also say that it also has connotations of something that's not actually very healthy for you either. So it suggests that their relationship is, something that they both really want, but is it good for them? But now I feared his honeyed embrace, the kiss that would turn my lips to a work of art. Honeyed relates to the colour of gold, so another reference to the colour gold here. And then the metaphor there in the final line, a kiss that would turn my lips to a work of art. Art is something to be admired, yet it can't change or be touched, and it's forever frozen. So that would be the effect of his touch on her. Okay, we're on to stanza 8 now. Bear with me a wee second. There we go. So in stanza 8, Mrs. Midas expresses her sadness of now being deprived of the opportunity to have a real baby. So because of his abilities, that is something that they can no longer do. And who, when it comes to the crunch, can live with a heart of gold? That night I dreamt I bore his child, its perfect four limbs, its little tongue like a precious latch, its amber eyes holding their pupils like flies. My dream milk burned in my breast, I spoke to the streaming sun. Okay, so again, a bit of sadness coming through in stanza 8. She's questioning the reader here and trying to justify her thoughts. The heart of gold is a metaphor. So normally when someone says, oh, they've got a heart of gold, that's a really positive thing, but this time it has negative connotations. So Duffy's kind of playing with her assumptions here. And we've got some positive word choice describing this baby that she's had a dream about. Ore and precious are associated with gold, but they're also really positive words. The word latch as well, that's worth pointing out. The reason that she's saying latch, it's like a metal latch. So although it's precious and perfect and beautiful, it is still ultimately cold and not real. And then it's amber eyes holding their pupils like flies. So this is actually quite, disturbing as we're picturing the dead eyes of the child. Amber is actually, something that you would find inside of a tree, and it can go quite sticky and get insects caught in it. So you might have been to, a museum or something where you see, for instance, different insects caught inside amber. Okay, so that's what she's referring to here. But it's also quite a horrible image. The ideas of these, eyes with pupils like flies caught inside it. It's quite a disturbing thought to think of this kind of golden baby. And again, the idea of having this child and, burned in my breast, it's all a dream. She can't actually do it. And this alliteration of the B sound shows the pain that she feels because she can't actually have a baby. This final line here, we've got the streaming sun, the alliteration reminding us that her world is always bright because of the gift of gold. Alright, so we're going to move on to stanza 9 now, where the consequences of the myth and the effect of their lives continues to destroy their relationship. And this is where things kind of take a really quite dark turn. So he had to move out. We'd a caravan in the wilds in a glade of its own. I drove him up under the cover of dark. He sat in the back. And then I came home. The woman who married the fool who wished for gold. At first I visited, odd times, parking the car a good way off, then walking. Okay, so this is quite a sad stanza here. Again, though, they're showing off about the fact that they've got this caravan in a glade of its own, but she seems quite defeated, so he had to move out. The short sentence here creating more impact. So she drove him up under the cover of dark, and this contrasts with the brightness of the gold that is their curse. The fact that he's sitting in the back as well suggests that she's ashamed of him, but also there's this sense of distance again. You know, they can't sit next to each other in the car, he has to be far away from her. Then this line here, the woman who married the fool who wished for gold. It's almost got like a bit of a nursery rhyme feel to it. And she has a negative view of her husband and by extension, herself. So she's annoyed at herself for marrying someone who could be so stupid to wish for this. The word choice of odd times is suggestive of the loneliness that they're both suffering from and the isolation. You know, she's not up to see him every day. She visited odd times. Alright, so on to stanza 10 now. So stanza 10 is presenting more images of the kind of isolation and the detached lifestyle that both characters are experiencing. You knew you were getting close. Golden trout on the grass. One day a hair hung from a larch, a beautiful lemon mistake. And then his footprints, glistening, next to the river's path. He was thin, delirious, hearing, he said, the music of Pan from the woods. Listen, that was the last straw. Okay, so again, we've got all these different words referring to gold and golden colours, suggesting how debilitating his gift has become. Everything is affected. So the fish, the rabbit, everything has been affected. Then the word choice here of delirious has connotations of imagining things that aren't really there, suggesting that his gift is driving him mad. Now, as we said at the start of this lesson, Pan is the god of shepherds and flocks and also of nature kind of more generally, but was isolated from other gods. Now, Pan as well, when we think about Greek mythology, is, you know, not necessarily a god with an awful lot of status. And it's suggesting that Midas has kind of, you know, fell down in terms of social order here, and he's part of the wilderness now. And then we've got these short sentences here at the end of this stanza. Listen, that was the last straw. So this is showing that very abruptly she's now cutting him out of her life. And again, all of this stanza, it sounds like she's talking to you as a friend almost and telling you about these issues that she's having. Okay, on to stanza 11 now. This final stanza stresses Mrs. Midas's anger at her husband's selfishness in making a wish that's not only affected him but deprived them both of any physical relationship and his wife of a chance to have her baby. What gets me now is not the idiocy or greed but lack of thought for me. Pure selfishness. I sold the contents of the house and came down here. I think of him in certain lights, dawn, late afternoon, and once a bowl of apples stopped me dead. I miss most, even now, his hands, his warm hands on my skin, his touch. Okay, so we've kind of moved away from the humorous tone that we've had in previous stanzas and the very whimsical, light-hearted tone that we had at the very start of this poem. The speaker is now very hurt and betrayed by her husband's thoughtlessness. So again, it sounds like she's kind of talking to you directly. There's a conversational tone. What gets me now is not the idiocy or greed, but lack of thought for me. Pure selfishness highlights her feelings. This is a very short sentence, and there's a bitter tone. So she's angry at what he's subjected her to. Okay, so when she's talking about when she thinks of him in certain lights, dawn and late afternoon, if we think about, that time of day and what the light looks like, photographers describe it as golden hour. Okay, and she remembers him at this particular time of day because the light is almost golden. All right. And then connotations of longing here when she's saying, I miss most. And she's regretting how things turned out. And then this final line here, his hands, his warm hands, there's repetition. Okay, so that's emphasising the importance of his touch throughout the poem. So his touch was important in the fact that it transformed things to gold, but that's not what she's missing. She's missing his touch before he was able to do that. So very well done if you've made it this far. I think that, it is quite a challenging poem, but there's lots for you to write about, particularly if you had an 8 marker, and it links really well to plenty of the other poems that we've studied so far. Take care and thanks for your hard work.